Science and spirituality, where we bridging modern therapy with ancient wisdom. And today I want to introduce you our teacher, that is Francisco Teixeira. He's here with us. Welcome. Thank you so much for you to be here with us. Thank you so much for your presence and wisdom that you will share today. Francisco, he is a scientist, neuroscientist, and he's psychologist, and he is owner of the Mu Lab. Sorry for my pronunciation. That is about neuroscience too. So he can explain us many things from different perspectives regarding trauma, regarding our brain, how it works, what is there. And for me, it's really exciting because when you know what is going on with person in front of you, with your client, you really can help and support in the best way, when you can see some things, when you can understand what is behind on many different levels. So I hope this lesson will give you much more possibilities and tools and depths in your work with yourself and with others. And welcome Francisco. He will speak about himself even a little bit more so you can know his work better. And I really invite you to speak so our students can understand in which situations they need to ask for help from professionals if they're more with psychotherapy, or if people need to check something about their health, when it's not enough only awareness facilitator approach, and we need to uh, ask for help from other areas to work with this person. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I will just share my screen. Is everyone seeing the screen? Is it working? Yes. Okay. So I will start. Thank you so much for this opportunity of bridging neuroscience and what I usually call ancient traditions that nowadays start to be more easy to understand what is happening into the brain while these experiences are unfolding. As I was introduced, my name is Francisco. I'm a psychologist and neuroscientist, and I've been studying the brain for already 15 years. I took my degree in Porto, here in Portugal. Then I went to London to study neuroscience at King's College London, where I did my master's in auditory hallucinations in schizophrenic patients to try to understand if the schizophrenic patients have emotional content on their auditory hallucinations. And I was using different types of neuroimaging techniques to understand which areas of the brain were activated when schizophrenic patients were listening to these typical voices. And then I moved back to Portugal, and I was doing research in the neuropsychophysiology lab in the University of Porto with psychopaths and empathy. I was using brain scans to understand if psychopaths, inmates, so psychopaths that were in prison, had what we call an empathy or fairness marker in the brain that could help us understand and classify the level of psychopathy of different prisoners that they were in prison. After that, I opened my own institute, my own company called Mu Labs, is the one that you can see here. Why is it called Mu Labs? So when I was doing research in the lab, this is a picture of me more than 10 years ago in a quite fancy brain scan device. When I was doing research, I understood that in the brain, when you create an empathic relationship with someone, when there's empathy and connection, you generate a brainwave called mu. So I was a little bit fascinated by this, so that's why I decided to open my project called Mu Labs. So I could study and research more about what creates empathy, and I could create tools and techniques to promote more empathy in my patients, because as I'm a clinical psychology, I do clinical, what we call clinical neuropsychiatry, and developing also softwares and tools for other practitioners to promote what we call a more empathic brain. This was in the beginning. So what I'm going to do today, because there's a specific theme that is neuroscience and trauma, I'm going to go through a little bit of theory about the brain, how the brain is composed, how it's organized, what are the main areas connected to trauma, what is trauma, what is affected during trauma, and then innovative techniques to help patients that have trauma. What I'm going to ask you is sometimes it's going to be complicated terms. Write your questions, and then in the end, we have half an hour for questions where I can answer your questions and I can go back to the slides that you had more doubts. Okay? So now I will continue until the end, so there's a flow on the explanation. Okay? So let's go to the brain. What is the brain? So the brain in neuroscience, we consider that is divided in different types of organization. We have the biological organization, the chemical organization, the anatomical organization, the electrical organization, and then the cognition, and then in the end, the behavior. Okay? So the biological organization is what we call the cell or the neuron. So the neuron is the fundamental unit of the brain, and you can see is a cell with a body where the nucleus is, and then you have different ramifications that are called dendrites. And these ramifications is what you see that when there's new connections, the cells try to connect with different cells, with other cells, with new cells, okay? Then you have the chemical layer. The chemical layer is what we call the neurotransmitters. And actually, there's two types of communication in the brain. There's electrical communication and there's chemical communication. And the chemical communication happens between neurons. And there's a gap between neurons, that is the synaptic gap. And this is where the neurotransmitters, the chemicals, go from one neuron to the other. Okay? The neurotransmitters are released from this presynaptic neuron into the postsynaptic neuron. Okay? And synapses, the term synapses comes from this, when two neurons connect through the chemicals that are released. And then there's different types of neurotransmitters with different roles on the central nervous system and on the peripheral nervous system. So you have activating neurotransmitters that activates different areas, that upregulates different functions, like dopamine, that is the pleasure neurotransmitter. Every time there is a pleasure pathway, a pleasure effect is dopamine that is released. Then you have noradrenaline or adrenaline that are also upregulated neurotransmitters that are connected with adrenaline, with activation, with execution, with fight or flight if we are stressed, and noradrenaline is connected with focus and concentration. All of these are upregulated neurotransmitters. Then you have more downregulated neurotransmitters like GABA. GABA is a calming. Every time there is GABA, and sometimes you see in some supplements that is GABA, it means that it's going to downregulate certain aspects of the brain activity. And then you have mood regulators. That is really important. Serotonin. And this is going to be really important to our class today. Serotonin is a mood regulator. It's what makes our emotions be more regulated. And then we have what we call binding neurotransmitters. So they fix stuff, they fix memories, they fix learnings. And these are glutamate and acetylcholine. They happen when you need to fix memories, new learnings, and so on. Then we go to the anatomy. So the anatomy is how the brain is organized. And this is really important. nowadays we know more and more about the anatomy. So we know that we have the cortex, that is what we call the neocortex, is the most recent developed area of the brain. We have the limbic system, that is the emotional brain. So the cortex is the rational brain. The limbic system is the emotional brain, is the reptilian brain. It comes before the cortex. And then you have the brain stem, that is what is in red. That is the survival brain. So let's go again. Survival brain, the first one, it makes we survive. Everything that is running away, understanding if something is hot, if it's cold, if there's danger is the survival brain, the brain stem. And then you have the emotional brain. It came after in development. It's already associated, for instance, with reptiles. That's why it's called the reptilian brain. It is in blue and allow us to categorize different experiences. If it's positive, if it's negative, if it's good, if it's bad, if it's intense, if it's not intense. We need to categorize to understand the importance of those experiences. And then we have the cortex that gives us rationality. It gives us execution, planning. So what is important for trauma is the limbic system. So the limbic system is what allows us to understand what is happening in terms of emotions. And the limbic system is composed, these are quite difficult terms, but it's only for you to have an understanding, is composed by different structures. The brainstem that brings information from the body, and then you have the amygdala, that is this structure here. We have the pituitary gland, that is a gland that segregates hormones. We have the hippocampus, that is here, the hypothalamus, that is also a gland, segregates hormones, and then it has some connections with the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is involved in the limbic system, even if it's a cortex area, and you will see and understand why. So let's go one by one. The amygdala is this one. The yellow small one that is here is the most important one. For sure, you already listened about the amygdala. Okay, the amygdala can be really activated or non-activated. It's responsible for fear response, threat detection, and aggression. So if there's a threat, it's the amygdala that gets activated. Is this yellow area. Emotional learning, associations between sensory stimuli and emotional events. It's called fear conditioning. So I understand that every time I go to my kitchen and there's fire and I burn myself, my amygdala will understand and associate that fire and kitchen can be dangerous. That is the association that starts to create. And then modulating memory influences the strength of memories with strong emotional content. This is really important. So the bigger the emotional content a memory has, the most intense it gets and the most saved it gets in your memory. So if you have an event that doesn't have emotional intensity, the probability that is not going to be saved in your brain is really big. If he has a strong emotional connotation, it's going to be saved. So that's why people remember traumas, even if they were really young. Okay, and this allows us to protect ourselves. Then you have the hippocampus. Is this yellow one connected to the amygdala. Formation of new memories, converting short-term memories into long-term declarative memories. So this happens is the more emotional an experience is, it goes from a short-term memory to a long-term memory and is stored in the hippocampus. So the amygdala classifies if it's intense or not, and then it goes to the hippocampus to be stored. And there's the storage. Spatial navigation encodes context where events occurred. So this is what tells your brain where it happened. It was in the kitchen. So I know that kitchen is a dangerous place because it's saved in my hippocampus. And then contextual memory processes content or setting in which the emotional memory event took place. It gives context. So this is kind of the library of the memories, the hippocampus. Then you have the thalamus. And the thalamus, it starts to connect our brain to our body. And all of this information about the emotions and the experience, they come from the body, from the senses. When I say body, it can be the tongue, the eyes, the ears, so everything that is sensors, okay? So sensory relay station routes incoming sensory information, except the smell, to appropriate cortical areas. So the thalamus is what sends the different senses to the correspondent areas, okay? So if it's vision, it goes to the visual cortex. If it's smell, it goes to the smell cortex. If it's the skin being touched, it goes to the sensory motor cortex. So the thalamus is what distributes this information. Then it modulates consciousness and alertness, plays a role in regulation, alertness, sleep cycles, and attention. So the thalamus is what makes us be attentive or not to what is happening and allow us to retrieve energy to be alert or not. And then integration of emotional circuits is what brings all the emotional circuits together. Then you have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, as I said before, is a gland. So it starts to segregate hormones. So what will happen is that the sensors bring information, the thalamus divides the information to the correspondent area, and according to what we are seeing, the amygdala classifies if it's important or not, and then it stores the emotional memory in the hippocampus. Then, according to what is happening, if it's really intense or not, the glands start to segregate hormones to change our body. And the hypothalamus is the first gland. So it regulates thirst, hunger, body temperature, and circadian rhythms. So when we are stressed, all of this changes. We stop having hunger, our sleep gets disturbed because the hypothalamus is hyperactivated. He also controls the endocrine glands, directly influences the pituitary gland to release other hormones. And then he does automatic or autonomic regulation. So everything that is the automatisms that our body has, like digestion, like heartbeat, is controlled by the hypothalamus. And if there's a stress response, all of this is going to change. Our heartbeat is going to change. Our digestion is going to change. And then we have the famous pituitary gland that is often referred as the master gland. It's the most important gland that we have of all the glands that we have. We have the thyroid in our throat. We have the adrenal glands above our kidneys. We have the thymus on our chest. And then we have the pineal gland and the pituitary gland in our brain. And the pituitary gland is the most important one because it controls all of the other ones. It's the ones that sends all the different hormones to control the others. So it controls growth factors and development in children. It controls the metabolism. It controls the reproductive health because it also controls the reproductive and the sexual glands. It's involved in stress regulation, fluid and electrolyte balance, and social and emotional interaction because it segregates oxytocin. That is the neurotransmitter and hormone of connection, of empathy. So this is, you can see why the pituitary gland is so important. Then the cingulate gyrus is what connects all of these limbic and subcortical areas with the cortex. You see this green big area here. It connects to all the cortex. So it gives more awareness and rationality to what is happening in the emotions that we are feeling. So it integrates emotions and cognition, influencing how do we understand the emotion that we are feeling, error detection and conflict monitoring. So this allows us to understand if actually it was a threat or not. For instance, if I go to the kitchen second time and the fire is not open, is my cortex, is my cingulate gyrus that tells me rationally that the fire is not open, so I don't need to be scared. So it gives me these more rational informations. And then attention is self-regulation. It regulates to where I should be attentive so I can understand better that emotion. And then is the last one, not the last one, almost, is the septal area that is connected to the prefrontal cortex. That is really important for what I'm going to explain in the front. So it regulates the pleasure and reward processing, and you will understand the connection more forward in the presentation, what the reward system on the brain is connected to trauma and addiction. And then he also regulates aggression and stress. And then the fornix, that is this structure here that connects all of the other structures. This was the limbic system. Then we have the cortex. I was already talking a little bit about the cortex. The cortex is the most evolved area of the brain, and it's divided by all of these different colored areas. The most important is the frontal lobe or frontal cortex, because it regulates everything that is emotions. So it can give more rationality to the emotions that come from the limbic system, and everything that is action, from planning to execution to also one thing that is impulse control. So is this frontal lobe that allow us to control our impulses, that allow us to live in society, and every time we are scared, don't scream, or every time we are really hungry, don't start running looking for food. This area controls us. So if this area is not working well, this will make people be more impulsive. Then you have the motor and the sensory cortex that we call sensory motor area. The sensory motor area is what regulates everything that comes from our sensors, and then what we need to operate. We need to move. That's why it's motor. If we need to move our hands, tongue to speak, everything comes from the motor cortex. And then the temporal lobe that is connected with the hippocampus, that is everything that is language and memory, is here on the sides. Occipital lobe is vision, and then the parietal lobe, it's what we call association. So it compares everything that is new on our senses to everything that we already have stored in our temporal lobe. So these are the different areas. So the prefrontal cortex, I was telling you that is one of the most important one in our cortex, because it regulates impulses, and it also regulates one thing that is the most important thing in trauma understanding, that is identity and ego. So our ego and our identity, sense of self, comes from this area. It's really here above the eyeballs. Is this orbital frontal area. So all of these different areas, they don't work alone. It's not like one area is working and then the other area is working alone and then there's the other area working. They work in networks. And there's three main networks. There's the default mode network, the central executive network, and the salience network. The one most known, even in psychedelic research or trauma research, is the default mode network, is this one. And the default mode network is responsible for the most important aspects of our lives. So everything that is connected with self-referential thoughts, as what is activated is the frontal area and the parietal area, what the default mode network does is relating ourselves to the world. So everything that is self-referential, so comparing who I am to the world, how I position myself compared in space, or how I position myself in time compared to the future and compared to the past, is the default mode network. So it's most active when our mind is at rest, not focused in external tasks. So it's a network that happens when we are inwards, thinking about ourselves. And we are thinking about the future or the past. It facilitates introspection, daydreaming, and reflection on personal identity and life events. Example, when people are depressed, they tend to be more inwards than outwards. They tend to have a lot of activation of this default mode network. They don't leave this default mode network, okay? Then is also responsible for autobiographical memory, recall of personal experiences, and integration of these memories into one's sense of self. It helps us to construct narratives about ourselves and drawing a memory episodic storage. Okay, so our biography, everything we think, every time we think about our biography, is this network. Mentalizing and social cognition. Mentalizing is a characteristic of our mind of thinking about the others, of thinking about the other's intention. That is called theory of mind. Okay, this is the base of learning. So kids start to have theory of mind at 5 years old, is when they detach their self from their mother. Until 5 years old, a baby thinks that he is the mother. That's why when the mother goes away, he starts automatically crying because some part of himself went away. After 5, he starts to understand that he's different from the mother. So he starts to have theory of mind. He starts to understanding that I have an emotion, my mother has another emotion. He starts to separate his self from another self. This is default mode network. And is also what we call task negative and resting state activity. So every time there is a task, the default mode network stops working. Every time there's no task and we are resting, the default mode network starts working and operating. Next network is the salience network. So the salience network is a network that is really important. It's kind of a buffer. Is between the two other networks, between the default mode network and the executive central network, and is a sensing network. So every time we are sensing, every time we are present, feeling everything that our senses is giving us, every time we are on our bodies, every time we are somatic, every time we are in flow state, we are working on the salience network. And this network allows us to understand if what we are feeling is important. So it informs the default mode network if it should go inwards and think about what is self-relation to what is happening, or it informs the executive central network, telling him if he should execute. So this is kind of a balancing network to help the other networks feeling what is happening, okay? And then you have the central executive network, the one I was talking about. That is an external network, is goal-directed. So every time we are executing something, every time you are working, performing a sports, thinking about or a goal is the executive network. So you're not inwards. You're not thinking about the past, the future, who you are. You're thinking about the task. You're outside. Okay? So as a sum up of these networks, you can see that you have the default mode network, that is introspection, rumination, if it's too much activated as a symptom, and motivation, you're not acting. You are sit down thinking about your past problems and your traumas. Then on the other extreme, you have the action. Goal seekers, task-oriented people, external stimulation seekers, they tend to be on the central executive network. They're always going to the outside. People that are afraid of getting in, of understanding who they are, people that they're craving always for something that is out, operate on the central network. in opposition to the default mode, that are people that are too much in. And then in the middle, you have the salience network, the flow state, the sensations, the interoceptive. Interoceptive is different from introspective. Interoceptive is feeling. Introspective is thinking about what is inside our inner world. So usually, there's a saying that says the space between our action and our reaction is when and where healing happens. And this space usually is the time you operate in the salience network. So the more you extend the time you are on the salience network, that you are feeling, that you are in flow, the more time and space exists between the action and the impulse, the reaction. And this allows you to understand what is happening and then act instead of reacting. Okay? So we are starting to understand what is important to overcome specific symptoms. Symptoms that are more connected with the default mode network, that is rumination, introspection, or symptoms that are more connected with the central executive network, that is more goal seeker, ADHD even, that you cannot stop, you're always looking for a task. And the secret to be outside of these symptoms is to be flexible between all of these networks. They are all important. What is not important is for you to get stuck in one network and not switch to the others, because you can be stuck in rumination and that's a problem. But if you're sometimes thinking about your past and future, that's okay. If you're stuck in goal-directed actions all the time and you don't assess or evaluate yourself, that's a problem. So the secret is to be polyphasic. And the polyphasic is neuroflexibility, is understanding how to switch between these networks. And you can achieve this neuroflexibility through different techniques, from psychedelics, breath work, somatic therapy, or neurofeedback. So now let's understand the other level of organization of the brain. This was the anatomical. Now we go to the electrical, electricity. So what is electricity? In the beginning, I was telling you that there is an electrical current that goes through the cells to communicate. So the cell has a negative pole, and every time there are ions of potassium, of sodium, and of calcium getting in and out of the cell, it creates a current, electrical current. And that's how the brain communicates. And this goes really, really fast. Okay? And this allows us to have this brain scans. This is when you see a brain scan, this is the electricity that you can pick up in the different areas of the brain. And this allows us to have the different brain frequencies that you sometimes hear, like delta, theta, alpha, and beta, and gamma. So for you to understand, delta is the lowest frequency, 0 to 5 hertz, is associated with the unconscious mind and with the collective consciousness. Is when we are in deep sleep. There's 5 cycles per second of information going through the brain. It's really low activation. Then you have theta here, is already between 5 and 8 hertz, 8 cycles per second of information going through the brain, and is associated with sleep, REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. Is when the dreams happen. You're not aware, you don't know what you have, you don't know, you're not awakened, but there's already some content. It's the dream space. With some trainings, you can even get aware inside of this state. Okay? If you activate the frontal cortex, that is where your ego is, during sleep, you can wake up inside of your own sleep. And you have what we call lucid dreams. Okay? Then the liminal of awareness is between theta and alpha. And alpha, when you go to 8 hertz, you wake up. You start to have more activation of the frontal lobe and you wake up. And then you're still relaxed, but you are aware. You are aware of your outside. Your senses are capturing what is happening on the outside. Then if you go a little bit up and higher, you have beta, a lot of activation. You can see here, it's a lot of activation. Sorry, a lot of activation here. So there's more information going through the brain. And it goes from 15 hertz up to 35 hertz. It can go really fast. It's associated with concentration, with focus, and is also associated with anxiety. And then you have gamma, that is the biggest one. But gamma is the famous gamma that happen, and you can see in high-end meditators. It doesn't happen all the time. You just have little spikes of gamma, and gamma goes up to 45 hertz. So the brain is working slow, and then zzz, it goes really fast. And gamma, because it's really fast, it runs through the brain, and then what it does is function is to synchronize all the different areas of the brain. So remember when I was talking about the different areas of the brain? They have different functions, so they work in different velocities. They don't need to be working at the same velocity, but they need to work synchronized. They need to be synchronized like this. And what gamma does, it goes really fast through the brain and it synchronizes. So when there's research about meditators, what they found is that when they are deep in meditation, even in what they call samadhi, they are operating in delta, in the collective consciousness, but then sometimes the brain goes really fast to gamma. So it goes from 5 hertz to 45 hertz. And they say that those moments of gamma is when they have insights, intuitions, channelings even, aha moments, because the brain connects the different areas and intuition happens, because intuition is information that is being processed so fast that you're not aware of it. So that's why gamma exists and is difficult to achieve it. You only can achieve it when you are on psychedelics, again, different types of breath work or long-time meditations. And I put this slide here to show you when I was talking about polyphasic states. So this is an example of a polyphasic state. So this person that is a breath worker compared with a non-breath worker, it can go from a low frequency state to a high frequency state. You can see here on the lines. This is an example that you can capture with EEG of a polyphasic person or a polyphasic state. Okay? Then when you have all of these areas well organized, the cells, the neurotransmission, the neurotransmitters, the anatomy, the electricity, your cognition is working well. And cognition is all of the psychological processes that is happening on your brain. And if this is all working well, and this is important, usually for a person to be healthy, he needs to have all of the different layers healthy, from the hormones, neurotransmitters, to how the different areas are activated, to the correct frequencies in the different areas, to have a behavior that is healthy and not unhealthy or pathological, as you see here on this slide. So all of this was the brain. Then we have the peripheral nervous system. The brain is the central nervous system. Then you have the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is everything that is not in the brain, that is in the body. And the peripheral nervous system is composed by the autonomic nervous system, that is all the nerves that control the systems that we don't control with awareness. Digestion, circulatory system, endocrine system, excretory system, breathing system, respiratory system. So we don't mess with it. If we needed to control this consciously, for sure we will die, because we needed to spend energy thinking about, let's put my heart working, let's put my digestion working. There's only one system that we can control, that is the respiratory system. That's why we say that breath is the door to the autonomic nervous system, because we can consciously control it. And the autonomic nervous system is divided by the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. I believe they are famous terms that you already heard. Parasympathetic calm state associated with rest and digest. So we always need to be resting to have enough energy to digest our food. That's why when we are stressed, we cannot digest. And then the sympathetic nervous system, that is arousing, fight or flight, stress. What regulates all of this? The vagus nerve, the famous biggest nerve that goes from the brain up to all the systems, all the glands, all the organs, digestion, and so on. And this vagus nerve can be on parasympathetic state, really relaxed, or sympathetic state, really activated. And this is the base of the polyvagal theory, where when we are ventral vagal, that is, the activation is more on the base of our spine, we have social engagement, we are okay to connect, we are open, we are not in threat. Then if there's a stressor, and you can see here on this graph, usually we should go like this, a little bit sympathetic, a little bit parasympathetic, a little bit sympathetic, a little bit parasympathetic. But when there's a trauma or when there's a stressor, we go really fast to sympathetic and it's fight or flight. Here we can still act. It's like, okay, let's fight. Let's react. But then if it's too much, we can go to what we call dorsal vagal and it's freeze. So we shut down. That's the freeze. So we block. So a victim, usually the stress is so intense that it passes the fight or flight. It doesn't flight. It doesn't go away of the trauma. It doesn't go away of the stressor or the aggressor. It stays and then it freezes. And then can come dissociation because you don't want to feel what is happening, numbness, depression, and after comes feelings of shame, guilt, shutdown, and so on, because you just dissociated of what was happening. Okay, this is really important to understand trauma. What is trauma? Finally, after understanding all these systems, brain, peripheral nervous system, vagus nerve, polyvagal theory, we go to the trauma. There's different types of trauma. You have direct trauma and you have indirect trauma. Direct trauma can be acute, one single happening that is so intense that your amygdala got activated, the memory got to the hippocampus, and you save that experience or similar experience as traumatic. Chronic, you have small trauma, but for a long period of time. That's typical of burnout. Okay, that's typical of war. And then complex, different stimuli that are stressors, but somehow they are connected. So there's not one, there's many. Okay, complex trauma. And then you have indirect trauma, what we call vicarious. So it's empathetic trauma. So if you continuously engage with someone that is traumatized, you can get traumatized. Okay? Secondary traumatic, nearly identical to post-traumatic stress disorder, involves relieving, avoidance, or hypervigilant response to someone else's trauma. It's similar to the vicarious. Compassion fatigue is when this is typical of therapists, that because they are giving empathy and compassion to people that are traumatized, they get tired, they get traumatized as well. And usually what happens is a rebound effect. You start to be less empathic to protect yourself. So as a therapist, it's important for you to be careful of this compassionate fatigue, indirect trauma, because you start to close yourself, you start to be more cold. And then the typical burnout. Okay? So for you to understand what happens between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic regulation of trauma, these are different examples of the types of trauma. When there's a mild stressor, what we have every day, there's the stressor here, the parasympathetic goes down, the sympathetic goes up, and then there's a rebound effect and they get into equilibrium. When there's a chronic stress, it's long in time. So what happens is that the peripheral nerve, the parasympathetic goes down, the sympathetic goes up, and they stay like this So there's always stress, continually stress. And then you have the traumatic stress response that is not chronic, is intense and acute. So it was so strong, you see, two lightnings, that it went really up. And then what happens is that the parasympathetic tries to compensate, and then it drops really fast. So you start to have what we call mix between shutting down and getting hypersensitive, shutting down and getting hypersensitive. Okay. So let's see what happens in the brain when there's trauma. This is from this slide, what I want you to understand is what we call the HPA axis, that is the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, adrenal gland axis. This is what happens in stress. So the hypothalamus and the amygdala understand that is a stress. It segregates this hormone called corticotropin release hormone that activates the pituitary gland, that will in its time segregate adrenocorticotropic hormone, that then will activate the adrenal gland to segregate cortisol. And cortisol is the biggest problem that we have, because cortisol creates oxidative stress to the cells, that makes cells die, that creates cancer, that acidifies our tissues. And then when there's a lot of cortisol, if the person is healthy, this will down-regulate the stress activation or the perception of threat, and everything will calm down. But if there is an intense trauma or chronic trauma, there's so much cortisol that this regulation cannot happen, and we are always thinking that there's a threat. There's no feedback negative loop to control this. So the chronic trauma starts to create the symptoms of trauma. Hyperarousal, so we are always aroused. And what is arousal? Is sympathetic state. We cannot digest, our heartbeat is always pumping, our pupils is always like open, we always like this. There's a negative feedback disruption, so the cortisol cannot be reabsorbed by the system. And there's hippocampal damage. Hippocampus is memories. So what happens is that the cortisol elevated impair the capacity of us saving memories. That reduces the ability of us understanding if that stressor can become safe or not, because we save that. And we save what came after. Imagine that after actually it came something that is safe, sorry. Or you went home after the trauma and there's a safe place. But because of the amount of cortisol that impaired the hippocampus, you cannot save that memory well, and you start to also re-traumatize your house as something dangerous. That's when you start to expand your trauma to other places. Okay. Then we have what we call the changes on the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex, as I was explaining to you, is responsible to give rationality to the trauma, and that make people understand if it actually is really a stressor event or not. And when there's too much cortisol, what is happening is that the prefrontal cortex shuts down and you start to have rational lucidity to what is happening. Okay. So if we go back to the networks, what happens to these networks, to the salience network, central executive network, and default mode network in trauma? So the default mode network gets stuck in self-focused loop. So you're always ruminating, you're always thinking yourself related to that trauma, how that person harmed you, how that situation was bad to you, and you start ruminating. The salience network, the sensing network, is hypersensitive. So you're always sensing everything. So even if there's a light or an intense sound or someone touches you, you're hypersensitive. You don't like it. And the central executive network shuts down. So that's why when you are traumatized, usually you cannot execute tasks. You have a tendency to go inwards. You don't have a tendency to do stuff. You cannot do stuff. Sometimes when you have a really complicated day with stress and you need to do a task, you cannot, because this central executive network shuts down. Okay. And then, according to this, you can have two types of trauma reaction. As we said before, you can have the dissociative, where the brain shuts down the body, so you don't feel anything. And with time, you can start to develop dissociation symptoms. It doesn't mean that you dissociated only during the trauma. You can bring that to your life. So every time there's a problem, you dissociate. So when people, they tend to shut down. You're talking with someone, and there's a fight, and they just go out. You can see in their eyes that they're out. They are dissociating. This is their way of protecting themselves. Okay? So it's a top-down mechanism. It's the brain that shuts down the body. Okay? And then you have the hypervigilance type. That is the brain hyperconnects the body, or the body hyperconnects the brain. So it's a bottom-up mechanism. So what happens is that you start to be always attentive to everything. You're always looking for danger because you're afraid that what happened before can happen again. And that consumes a lot of energy. Okay? So when the trauma gets stuck into the body, so let's talk a little bit about somatization. This is a really interesting book, The Body Keeps the Score. I believe some people already know it. So when you have a traumatic experience and on the polyvagal theory graph, you freeze or you dissociate, what happened is that you didn't close your fight or flight reaction. In the middle of the action, that should have a beginning, middle, and end, that is running away, that is fighting, in the middle, you shut down. So that loop or that imprint is kept on your muscles. So that's why you get tense. So that's why when you remember a trauma, you tend to get tense because you initiate that somatic reaction, but then because it didn't end it, you get stuck there. That's why you tend to accumulate the traumas in your muscles, in your back. Okay, so the motor programs freeze. The body natural defense movements, they start, but then they didn't end. So what does this create? Sometimes, or most of the times, it creates compulsions. So compulsions are coping mechanisms that are pathologic for people to release the anxiety and the tense somatic that you have on your body through repetition of behaviors. So first, there's a thought. Usually it comes with a rumination because the default mode network is stuck. The thought brings anxiety. So imagine going back to the kitchen. I need to go to the kitchen. And then I start ruminating. Maybe there's a fire. Maybe there's a fire. And then I get anxious. So the anxiety leads to the compulsion. I need to do an action to release this anxiety. This action can be biting nails. This action can be movements. And when I do this, there's a relief because this will somehow unlock these patterns that I have stuck in my body. But if it's too intense, you can get compulsive eviction. So instead of doing mannerisms, that is biting the nails and so on, you go to substances. So you self-medicate to relieve the stress and to do some kind of emotional regulation. So you can go for pleasure, dopamine substances or behaviors, so you can feel more pleasure when the anxiety kicks in, like cocaine, sex, food, digital media, or high-risk activities. Or you go to serotonin. Some people tend to go to amphetamines or MDMA to create the emotional balance. Or you go to GABAergic. Remember GABA, down-regulating, anxiolytic effects, opioids and ketamine, okay? Because they lack of impulse control. Why? Remember, what controls the impulses? The frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe, because of the cortisol, is shut down. So you cannot control these impulses. So this creates a loop. You're stressed, you have a trauma, you're stressed, you have a compulsion, you cannot control your impulses, you go for drugs or self-medication. That imbalances your body. It can acidify even more your body. It can create even more cortisol, and this loop repeats, and this is the loop of addiction. Okay? Finally, how can we solve this? How can we control this, modulate this? There's different techniques. In our clinic, we tend to call it biohacking techniques that can be more ancient, from breathwork, contrast therapy, that is sauna and cold therapy, psychedelics, somatic release, or even having a ketogenic or fermented food that disinflammate our body, our digestive system, okay? Or we can have more technological light entrainment, that is light therapy through flickering, chromotherapy, neurofeedback, or by neuroscience. Okay? So let's focus a little bit on psychedelics, breath, and meditations that are some part of what you learn and do. So we know that psychedelics usually are tryptamines, and I'm going to go a little bit fast through this part. So psychedelic tryptamines are like DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, psilocybin, or LSD. Why are they psychedelic? Because they bind into the 5-HTP sensors or receivers that we have. And this 5-HTP is the same receiver, or 5-HTP2A, that our serotonin also binds. Okay? So what you need to understand is that when there's a psychedelic experience, there's usually two factors. The 5-HTP or 5-HTP HT2A that binds to the serotoninergic receptors, and there's also MAO inhibitors or beta-carbolines that help these 5-HTP molecules to stay more time in the body. So what happens to your systems? Remember the main systems: default mode network, salience network, central executive network, when you take psychedelics. So there's a reduced default mode network connectivity, allowing the default mode network to be less dominant. So that's why default mode network is self-referencing yourself to the future, past, rumination. So it shuts down the default mode network. So it means that your self-oriented or your ego dies. That's the common ego death, because the default mode network shuts down. So you start to see the trauma from a perspective, from an outside perspective, outside of you. So the fire in the kitchen or the dog that attacked me, I can see the dog as an agent that didn't attack me. So I can start to reformulate that experience when I'm during a psychedelic experience. Dissolution of ego. And is also important for the introspection. So you start to see the trauma and you start to experience it, but without, again, the ego. What happens to the salience, the feeling network? So there's more emotional salience. So people feel even more the emotions. So you feel even more the trauma. That's why sometimes some experiences are intense, because you're feeling everything again. But because you're feeling everything again without the ego, without the default mode network, you just feel it. You don't feel it hitting you. Okay? And this will help you, if you are in a safe setting, to re-encode the sensations. Okay? So it's important to be attentive to re-traumatization. So that's why it's important to have a safe setting, because you can feel everything again. And if you don't have in a safe setting, you can re-traumatize and it can be even worse. Okay. And then you have the central executive. So what happens is that usually it shuts down as well as it happens in a trauma. So when you are doing psychedelic experience intense, you cannot drive a car, you cannot execute. Your execution is shutting down. So there's two that shuts down. That is the default mode, ego, execution, and what arises in activity is the salience. Remember when I showed you the graph that the salience network gives you the space between the action and the reaction, and that space gives you the space to heal. That happens during a psychedelic or entheogenic experience under the eyes of neuroscience. So when the trauma gets into the body, we can see the body, that the body has a memory. So when you do a psychedelic experience, sometimes happens is like involuntary movements or involuntary somatic release. You start to have movements. So what is happening is that because of the salience network being more activated, these unfinished motor programs that got stuck during the freeze state, during the trauma, they can unlock. So it's kind of, during the psychedelic experience, you manage to close the loop that wasn't closed during the trauma. That's true. That's why you sometimes have movements, or sometimes people even, they act as if they were in a trauma and they are finishing what they didn't finish when they had a trauma. Okay. So this can lead to memory reconsolidation, what we call reconsolidation. So the memories come again to awareness because they somehow are stuck in the somatic body, but usually they come in symbols or archetypes. And I was really curious about this, and I read in a paper that the brain tends to save energy. So if during an experience it was bringing all the memories as they happened, that would consume a lot of energy. So it brings you or parts of the memory or symbols that help you understand the memory, but not as it in its foolish. That's why usually there's a lot of symbolic content during these experiences. So talking about this re-traumatization, it's really important to be this loop to be complete. That's why integration with somatic therapies are important after an experience and a psychedelic experience, because sometimes people need to, what they saw or what they revived during the ceremony, sometimes they didn't close in the ceremony. So during an integration with somatic therapy, they can act as if they closed that event or that movement or that reaction. Okay, it's important to complete the loop. Purging. So purging is really typical as well. And this happens because there's one thing that we call the gut-brain axis. So the gut is connected with the brain. If you didn't know, 90% of the serotonin neurotransmitter that we have in our brain is created by our gut microbiome. So if we don't have a healthy bacteria, we don't have healthy serotonin. So this is how we are dependent of having a healthy gut for our mental health. And during ayahuasca, because of the MAO inhibitors, that they are emetic, they cause vomiting, what happens is that a serotonin surge, because again, the 5-HTP, they bind to the serotonergic receptors, they create this reflex of purging. And by creating that, they trigger the gut-brain axis to reset. So it cleans the gut and it creates a kind of digestive parasympathetic reaction of resetting and closing also the loop of the trauma that was stuck on the digestive system. So I can read it for you. The gut-brain axis is a two-way communication system, and through chronic stress or trauma, this gut function is disrupted, creating IBS symptoms, for instance, or leaking emotional states. Under ayahuasca, the same channel might serve as a physical expression of the letting go. Energy or emotional intensity can be discharged not only through tears or trembling, but also by vomiting. Okay? So there's a vagal activation that creates the purge. So what we have been finding in neuroscience is that, and in neuroscience research, is that what happens during a psychedelic or entheogenic experience, default mode network shutting down, executive mode network shutting down, salience network going up, parasympathetic regulation through vagal activation and somatic release, and brain digestive axis also releasing. We find with some breathing techniques, from breath holding techniques like kumbhaka in the normal pranayama, or hyperventilation like kapalabhati in the normal pranayama. Why? Because when you achieve hypoxia, for instance, when you do breath holds, or hypercapnia, that is a breath hold. So hypoxia is a breath hold with air. Hypercapnia is a breath hold without air. What happens is that the pH starts to be regulated. So the more CO2 you have, because of the breath holds, for instance, the more alkaline your tissues start to be. And what alkaline does, it somehow takes away the free radicals that are H plus, hydrogen plus, that are byproducts of cortisol. So if there's oxidity in the cell and is also connected with cortisol and trauma, the fact that you are increasing CO2, it releases that trauma. So that's why during breath holds, sometimes you have somatic releases. You see traumas, you start shaking because you activate this system, the parasympathetic system, and you induce the same states that happen during a psychedelic experience by lowering down the frontal activation, default mode network, and then increasing the salience. This is only a concept that maybe is important for you, that is the Bohr effect and the Alden effect. So the Bohr effect and the Alden effects are two effects that happen when you have or too much oxygen in your system because of hyperventilation, or too much CO2 in your system because of breath holds. And this exchange of gases that happen during these two extreme effects, it's what makes you going from sympathetic to parasympathetic. And then if there's a healthy regulation of the vagus nerve, you release serotonin. That initiates all of this cascade of parasympathetic release. So to end, and I think I have more 5 minutes, and then we can go to questions. We can have the integration somatic therapy. So when you have somatization, what is important for you to understand as an integration is that not a purely bottom-up focus therapy that is from the brain to the body, that is more cognitive behavioral, that is more talking about what happened, about the trauma, about the experience, is not enough. You should also have a bottom-up approach, a somatic approach. You should combine both. You should have integrated somatic and cognitive strategies, because combining sensory-based techniques such as mindfulness, attention to touch, attention to posture and movement with awareness, that is cognitive awareness, you can bridge the mind-body gap that the trauma created. Okay, because trauma sometimes creates dissociation or sometimes creates hypervigilance. And this is really important when there's integration, because If you're closing the loop, if you're making people going back to what they saw and do the movements to close the experience, but now because they are not under the influence of any psychedelic, they are full aware. And because they are full aware, they can revive the somatization of the trauma in a different way. Let's go to the technology. So just I can understand and talk and explain to you what is the neurofeedback, and then we can end. It was a lot of information, I know. So when we go to the electrical brain, remember, we can do what we call neurofeedback in the clinic. And neurofeedback is composed by two moments: an assessment, that is a brain scan called quantitative electroencephalogram, where we can understand which areas of the brain are activated and not activated, to understand if those areas and networks that I was explaining are active or not. And then by comparing in the database, we can see which percentage of more default mode network, more executive network, or more salience network do you have. And after knowing this, we can do what we call neurofeedback. And neurofeedback is a training. So by capturing in real time with these small devices like the Muse and this one, what is happening in the brain, and retrieving that information by a tangible medium that can be sound and visuals, you can learn how to self-regulate. I have an example here. If you can see and listen to the sound. So what is happening is that he's controlling the sound and the movement of these visuals with his mind. Every time he's losing control and is anxious, the sound is more and the visuals are more active. Every time he learns how to self-regulate the brain frequencies to get a more sympathetic state and less beta brain frequencies in the brain, the visuals tend to stop and the sounds tend to stop. So instead of being passive, waiting for an external factor, like a medication, passive therapy, where someone is giving therapy to him, or even psychedelic, here is active. He's active on regulating his brain because the feedback loop is acting as a mirror, showing him how his brain is working or not. And for trauma therapy, what happens is that we combine neurofeedback with psychotherapy, cognitive and somatic. So we make people talking and try to remember the trauma, and what happens is that they lose control. So all because they are activated. There's cortisol, there's a sympathetic activation, and the sound goes up. And they need to self-regulate, even if they are talking or imagining the trauma. Or even sometimes we use VR devices to replicate the traumatic experience in a more advanced situation. And we do systematic desensibilization. What is this? Imagine that you have a trauma with a spider. We show you a little spider and you get activated. And then you need to regulate the sound. It means that you self-regulated yourself to be calm. And then we can show you a bigger spider and you get activated. And then with systematic desensibilization, slowly, we start to help you regulating and you being the actor of your own self-regulation. Sometimes you use even scents to bring up the memory of the trauma, to help you, bringing up what is happening. Sometimes we use different senses, like heart rate variability, galvanic skin response, to understand how the peripheral nervous system is acting, not only the brain. And this is an example of a scan before a 1 month of neurofeedback and after 1 month of neurofeedback, by doing it 2 times a week. The hyperactivation in beta that shows us amygdala activation and hippocampus activation because of a trauma disappears. Okay. And this is another technique that is light entrainment. So it's a flickering light that stimulates your hippocampus and by stimulating your hippocampus, regulates all of that system that I was explaining to you in the beginning. And we can do individual or collective. And I have videos to show you, and then I promise is the end, and we can go to questions.
Imagine a world where light and your brain work together for unlimited creativity and better mental well-being. Eyes closed, the gentle light triggers your optic nerve, stimulating the different brain waves like alpha, beta, theta, delta, gamma, each showing our mental states from creativity to relaxation and focus. Alpha wave experience is initiated by the light installation while melodic beats guide your journey. A neurotransmitter headband captures your brainwaves' unique variations and translates them in emotions in real time. Through advanced AI, your brainwaves turn into visual art created directly from your visions. Your brain's artistic symphony becomes a unique digital art piece with mind art. Join us on this journey where you become the artist. Imagine a world where light...
And I have the last video.
What if light and sound could take you on an inner journey? The Oracle is an immersive installation that modulates your brain waves. These waves are connected to deep relaxation, creativity, and self-reflection. The installation uses specific light patterns that stimulate your optic nerve and guide your mind into a dreamlike state. This experience mimics the insight people often reach during deep meditation or while using psychedelic, but without any substances. Research shows that alpha wave can improve focus, reduce stress, and increase mental clarity. The Oracle allows you to access these benefits easily. It combines art and technology to enhance your awareness. What if light?
Okay, so that was it. Sorry if it was intense and too many concepts, but I think it was important to go through all these different levels, start slowly, then go to the trauma, and then what happens to the brain when you do more ancient traditions like psychedelics, breath work, and somatic work, and now these future technologies that exist like neurofeedback and light entrainment. And now I think we have 20 minutes for questions. Maybe we can extend a little bit more.
Wow, Francisco, thank you so much for this lecture and presentation.
Thank
We are
you.
really impressed. And how you combine all of these things about psychedelics and breathwork. And for me, everything is very aligned with what Satya gives in school, and it's true addition. Thank you so much. So if anyone has a question, please write. Yes, raise your yellow hand, and we will go one by one, okay? Let's go, Daisy.
Thank you. Is it possible to put it back? It's still sharing the screen, so it's just hard to find. I don't know. Yes, thank you. So I had quite a few, so I don't know how many am I allowed to ask? Is my question. I'll start with one and then see if it's possible. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So at the beginning, one of my questions was when you were talking about the strong emotions and how you have the memory with this when you have a strong emotion. My question is, what happens to the when you have a really strong trauma where you freeze and numb out and there is no memory? Does that mean that there was no strong emotional content? This is referring to the amygdala.
So usually what happens is that when there's a really strong emotion or stressor, the memory or the hippocampus gets impaired. So the ability of memorizing what happened clearly or what happened after or even before can be shut down. For instance, when a car crash, most of the people don't remember anything. Not because they hit with the brain, but because it was so traumatic that the brain hippocampus didn't record it. But the somatic memory stays. That's why, even if you don't remember the car crash, if you get into a car, even not knowing why, you get stressed, you freeze. That's why some people have traumas that they don't understand why, so they don't know what happened, and that happens a lot with sexual abuse. The people tend to erase the memory, but every time they starting to have a sexual interaction, they freeze and they don't know why. And then during breath work and ayahuasca ceremony, they revive it, and then they understand why.
Okay, because it's so that's with the hippocampus, because when it was referring to the amygdala, it was also like when you have strong emotions. So are those two separate things then? Like, is that the hippocampus that's taking more aware? Because
the amygdala decides if it's strong or not. The hippocampus
so
saves
that's my question, yeah, because the amygdala decides if it's strong or not, right? And that creates, so if there's a strong emotion, the memory is there. So that was my question, like that's what I mean is, so the amygdala decides, but then in the cases of where it was too much and too strong, it goes to the hippocampus. Is it, or,
Yes.
I mean, what, okay.
The thing is that, remember when I talked about the cortisol affecting the hippocampus? So the amygdala can decide that is a strong memory, and then it goes to the hippocampus. But if there's a lot of cortisol, and usually what happens is that the memory starts to be impaired more if there's continuous cortisol. And then the cortisol affects the hippocampus' ability to store it.
Okay. Thank you. And I was just wondering, where can you get these tests? Because I saw you in a few of the photos. Like, can you get these tests done? And or is this with trials? Like, to if you wanted to check how your brain is, or
you can come to the clinic is in Lisbon. I can
okay.
share with the team maybe the contact, and then if someone wants to have the contact,
Please.
I think is the best.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Okay. Hi, Francisco.
Can I?
Vanessa, you in a hurry?
No, I'm not in a hurry.
Okay, I'll go because I'm here. Francisco, amazing, fascinating, incredible. Thank you for bringing this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. I have a few questions. First of all, you said at the beginning you went to jail to see if psychopaths in jail had serotonin. No, empathy receptors.
Yeah, if they have the mu wave, the mu brain wave, that is the empathy brainwave. So we were testing, because at the time we weren't testing hormones, we were testing EEG markers.
Right.
So there's a marker of empathy that is the mu. It's called mu wave, and we were checking if in a social interaction we created a game, an economic game, they would have empathy or not.
And
they didn't.
They did.
They are psychopaths.
Is it possible for them to get empathy?
That's a really good question. There's a difference between sociopaths and psychopaths. I don't know if you know the difference. Sociopaths, they're context created. So you're not a psychopath, but because you live in a not so good area with crime, to survive, you create crimes. And there's a psychopath. There's an intrinsic lack of empathy because you lack this mu brainwave or oxytocin. Okay. There's some therapies of giving oxytocin through nose vapor to see if they get more empathetic. There's some results.
Wow.
There's some results, but is not long term.
Okay.
Because it's a trait, it's a personality trait.
Fascinating. That people are born with, or it's a trauma response?
There's different theories. There's
Okay.
different theories. There's always a component. There's always a ratio between genes and experience. Some people, and it depends on the trauma factor. So you can have 90% probability, genetic probability to be a psychopath. So you don't need much trauma to develop that. Or maybe you just have 10%, but then you have a big trauma and you just, through epigenetics, you develop, even if you didn't have much genetic predisposition, but then it was so intense that you tend to block.
Okay. Fascinating. Okay, my other question is, you talked about serotonin being a mood regulator. My basic understanding of serotonin is it's a love drug. And my understanding of that is when you're in love with somebody, you produce more serotonin through touch and things. What's my question? It's a mood regulator, or it's like the love drug, or like what's the relationship between the two?
So usually, when you're in love, you have three ones completely on fire. Oxytocin, that is bonding, it's connection.
Oh, that's what I mean.
Mothers, when they are pregnant, they release a lot of oxytocin because they need to love another being that is inside of them. Serotonin is also released because you need to regulate your mood. Okay. Because you have a lot also when you are in love, you have also dopamine. That's why it's addictive. Yes. Being in love is addictive. So these are the three ones that are more. So the passion, the addiction, the compulsion comes from the dopamine. The emotions being regulated. That's why you feel good when you're in love. You wake up in the morning and you're like, the serotonin. And then the oxytocin is what makes you connect. Like you want to hug, you want to connect. These three are the ones usually in love.
Okay, thank you. I got them mixed up. Last question is, with somebody who's got like severe OCD, but what's like a short-term, something you can short-term advise or suggest for them before like doing deeper trauma work?
As a therapy or as a technique or a coping mechanism?
Yeah.
Usually try to think about the salience network. Try to think about that network that is the feeling, is the body, like it's getting out of the brain, getting out of executing stuff in repeat and tapping into the sensations. So everything that is body, feeling the body, grounding, takes them out of the mind or out of the task, repetitive task.
Oh, okay, got it. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Is there more questions?
Can I now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Francisco. A lot of information. My brain is doing like tilt. But thank you for sharing all your, My question is about your opinion of chronic disease, like in case of fibromyalgia, that I heard it's like a disconnection or uma desinterrupção between the nerve system, the central, and the os tendões, nerves, muscles. What is your opinion about that? If for sure it's connected to a trauma?
It is.
And how can someone heal or try it with your perspective?
So fibromyalgia is a somatic disease. So this means that in the nerves, there's a band around the nerves that is called myelin. Imagine like electrical cord that you have the copper inside and then you have the plastic rubber around to isolate the conductivity. So the nerves have myelin that do that, isolate the conductivity. When there is oxidative stress in the cells, that usually is created by inflammation, cortisol, and so on people that have that disease, this myelin starts to degrade and the connections doesn't flow. The electrical connection doesn't flow in the extremities. So every time there is more stress, they get more symptoms. They cannot move their bodies, they get stuck, they have seizures because of this oxidative stress in the cells because of cortisol. So my advice, everything that is relaxation, avoid stress, and then fermented food to disinflammate. If you disinflammate your gut, if you disinflammate your intestine, the chances of having more free radicals or oxidative stress lowers down. So there's a big correlation between inflammation, IBS syndrome, and these symptoms as well. So if you do fermented, if you try to avoid meat, if you no sugar at all, that will help a lot. Of course, if you have a good stress moment, even if you have a good food, you're going to have the symptoms. So it's trying to avoid stress and avoid inflammatory food.
You said, sorry, I didn't, meat too?
Yes, meat inflammates. Okay. Not big, meat is important because of many reasons, but people need to understand that it is a type of food that inflammates the system. It inflammates the bowel and the intestine. So
Okay.
certain conditions would be helpful not to have so much meat.
Because in keto, you eat a lot of meat.
You don't need to. You don't need to. You can have ketogenic food without having meat.
Okay.
Meat is ketogenic, but doesn't mean that a ketogenic diet has meat.
Okay. Thank you, Francisco.
Welcome. Should I read the questions that are written?
We have one more hand here, and then if we still have time, we can answer to the questions written in the chat, okay?
Okay.
Okay, then my turn. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm also feel overwhelmed, but very also excited at the same time. My question is, you said that to close the loop of the trauma, part of it's the body movement, body release, because it's stored in the body. So does it mean that it's not possible to close this loop of trauma without the body movement? So let's say people who, I don't know, meditate for years or like do some mental work, they are not actually closing the trauma because it's still stored in the body and it requires some body release.
In my opinion and my vision, I think you always need a somatic work to close the loop. There's different types of meditation. There's even meditations that you can go inwards. We call it the rotation of consciousness, when you tap in and you analyze all your body, and that allows you to even feel stuff that are in the body. But if you don't give movement, if you don't give shaking, or if you don't give the release of the closing of the loop, only awareness and not somatic work, I don't believe that does the full work.
And at the same time, if it's, I don't know, body movement, but not no awareness, it also won't work, right? So let's say it's ecstatic dance, I don't know, but person is really not like aware, you know, like, or working with the trauma, like, or whatever in the process. So it's not connected then. It will be just some, okay.
If you go running just because it doesn't heal your traumas. So you need to be in the trauma to then have the lock of the movement, and to be in the trauma is not easy. That's like what we all trying to do, is to go to the trauma. And to go to the trauma, you can go through meditation, you can go through psychedelics, you can go through breath work, and then when you are in the trauma, you need a movement. When you are in ecstatic dance, you not go to the trauma. You're just dancing.
Got it. Thanks. And another question is about the types of trauma reactions. So you said dissociation and hypervigilance. So in dissociation, it's top down. So you said brain or body shuts the
Top
brain.
down. Top down. It's the brain shuts the body. The brain doesn't want to receive anything from the body anymore because it knows that the body makes the brain suffer.
Okay. And in the another one,
Hypervigilance is bottom up. The body hyperactivates the brain. It's kind of the body screaming for the brain to be aware. It's like, look at everything, brain, because I'm hypersensitive because there's always danger.
but in both cases, it means there's no connection with the body, like, I mean, no aware connection. So body just sends these signals, but it's not that I'm, connected with my body if I'm reacting.
Hyperactivate. So when we say connection, we say a regulated connection. So hyperactivation, imagine this as, I usually give this example to my patients. You have a structure here in the thalamus that looks like a doorman that allows people to get in and out. If you have no one getting in and out, there's nothing happening. There's dissociation. If you have a lot of people like going out, there's problems. People fall, they get damaged. So there's a non-regulation communication. There's still information going up, but it's not regulated. So we cannot say that it's completely disconnected because there's flow of information, but there's a non-healthy connection between the brain and the body.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
So now is 8:00 and questions arriving more and more. Francisco, do you have a few minutes more for some questions?
I don't mind. No problem. I can stay all night.
But we are from all over the world, so for some people now it's really night. So what I would do, and I would propose, we have here some questions that were like some time before, from Nikki, from Inna, then Olga raised her hand, and then we have questions from Daisy. So maybe we can go faster through them and we don't receive more questions, okay? And maybe there is from Daisy, I see like many questions, but maybe they're combined with each other. Let's stop on this, okay? Here. So I will read question here from Nikki. He was the first one or next one. Thank you, Francisco. Is there any measurement of the brain waves after a person took DMT as medicine or ketamine, psilocybin? Is the brain going to operate at gamma waves and so on?
There's more and more studies nowadays with this type of substances, psychedelics. We are kind of in neuroscience living the revival of psychedelic research. Before it was in the 70s with Strassman and the US. Now it's coming again, and we are really thankful for that. And yes, gamma is one of the brainwaves. As I was explaining, usually you get hypoactivation of the cortex, and then you have the salience network that is more thalamic and subcortical activated, bringing information and somatic information. But then sometimes there's gamma, the gamma spikes that synchronizes everything. It's so fast that synchronizes the different areas, and is usually when people, because they do, how does research happen? So they are recording a moment, and then they ask the people to talk when they are having insights or when they remember a trauma and so on. And then they synchronize and they understand that the moment they had an insight, like when they saw something or they had an epiphany or the things that you experience during a psychedelic experience, and they go and they correlate and they see at that moment there was a spike of gamma in the brain, EEG. So they start to do these correlations of insights, intuition, and gamma spikes.
Thank you very much. Next question was from Ina written, and I believe it was connected to question from Vanessa about sorry, my English here. And honestly, I don't know this disease in English. The same for Hashimoto. Maybe Ina, you can ask, what do you mean? Are you still here?
I
Yeah.
don't know.
Hashimoto, Юлечка.
Hello, autoimmune disease related with thyroid. I don't know how to say it.
Yes.
Hashimoto.
So everything that is autoimmune is stress related. Is you have so much oxidative stress in your system that there's an imbalance immune response. So your immune response is too much activated, and it starts to fight your own cells. Let's call it that way. The thing is that I think now it's changing. A lot of things are changing in research. But back in the days, people weren't associate all of these diseases to be psychosomatic. And now they start to understand that they are. So by regulating stress, by regulating the food as well, the inflammation, and we start seeing that even diseases that before they thought they were chronic and they weren't reversed, they start to reverse.
But do you recommend to the I don't know, you talked about the food, the fermented food?
Fermented, see, and non-inflammatory and fermented food.
Okay. Okay.
Because
That's
fermented
important.
food helps the gut microbiome. The gut microbiome, if it's healthy, as we saw, 90% of the serotonin that we need are going to be on point. Regulation, mood regulation, all of those systems start to work well. You stop having so much cortisol, you start to regulate, and you don't have so much immune response.
Okay. Thank you, Francisco.
Welcome.
Thank you,
may I?
Ina. And Olga, where are you? I lost you. You were the next one. Can you raise your hand again? Yellow one. Okay. I'm trying to find you.
I would also like to make a question. I don't know how to raise the hand. I don't find it.
It's Marta speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and Olga, where are you? Will you ask your question? Marta, I hear you. I just trying to organize by the
Yes.
order how it was. So I don't see Olga and I don't hear Olga. Maybe she disappeared from the room. When she will arrive, maybe it will be still time. Okay, so Marta, let's go to your question.
You were telling about thank you so much for the class, first of all. You were telling about the insights. There is a gamma happening, a peak of gamma. My question is if in situations of schizophrenia, if that also happens, if there is any connection when people have psychotic surge, if that's also
Schizophrenia is a really interesting theme because there's schizophrenia that in the right setting is not schizophrenia, and people are just not well guided, like autism, for instance, because there's always at least this is how I see things and so on. There's always a good thing and a bad thing about a disease. A disease is a non-regulate. It is a non-regulation. So with symptoms, sometimes come other abilities, like autistic kids. They cannot connect with people, but they can go and do tasks that are really difficult to do. They are always on the executive. Schizophrenic people, they are really sensitive to this inner world, let's call it that way. And when you tap into these states, these psychotic states, that sometimes they can be psychedelic, and the liminal between a psychedelic state and psychosis is thin. Usually is remember when I was talking about the polyphasic states, your ability to jump from one state to another really easy, that means that you're flexible. What happens into a schizophrenic person is that he gets into sometimes even a psychedelic state. So he's operating in a state that non-ego, he thinks everything is connected to him and so on, but then he cannot tap into the reality and switch from that state. So he continues delusional. Sometimes they even, and I have many patients with schizophrenia, they even saying, connecting dots that we never connected, and they are right, and they are true. But then they cannot bring that to the real life, let's call it that way, because they lack the switch capability of the networks. It's the same thing as if you are in a ayahuasca ceremony and you connect with everything and you see all of the things that you see, and then the ayahuasca ceremony is over, but you cannot detach from that space. And then you need to go to work or drive your car. So that's complicated. So regarding the gamma frequency, I believe that they have gamma. I never read a study about gamma and schizophrenics, but for me it makes sense that they have gamma in certain associations that they are doing.
And my next question would be, given all the information that science already brought and the development, if for you there is space for spirituality.
Can you repeat the last part?
If for you there is space to embrace a more spiritual approach of life, or if for you it's more scientific.
No, I think it's changing a lot. Neuroscience is changing. Like the first study of ayahuasca and neuroscience happened in Portugal a year ago in the Faculty of Coimbra of Medicine. More and more, there are institutes that would research this type of things. Of course, it's important to understand what is spirituality. I always say that the semantics are important. If spirituality is understanding different techniques of self-awareness, if it's understanding ultra states of consciousness or ultra states of consciousness, if that is spirituality, neuroscience is now like a lot on that. Because nowadays there are more tools to assess that. From the EEGs, AI is helping a lot because it's seeing patterns that we normal human beings cannot see, and then the AI is just looking to the data and understanding and making connections and correlations. So, because all these ultra states and ultra states, the brain is not linear, it's parallel. So our brain doesn't operate like from here that this happens and this happens. So if I listen to a noise, this means that someone is in my kitchen. In an ultra state or ultra state, this doesn't happen. Our brain works not linearly, it works in parallel. So this means that the associations are made kind of with jumps. So a linear kind of neuroscientific thinking doesn't allow us to understand anything of the psychedelic ultra states. We need to have another type of thinking that now these new tools are allowing us to have. So I think it's a really interesting era that is happening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. So Olga came back. We lost you. Please jump with your question. Open your.
Yes, thank you. Apologies, my computer decided to stop working exactly at the wrong time. So I'm now in with my phone. But thanks for everything. Thanks, Francisco, for the talk. I wanted to ask about aging pathologies like Alzheimer's in relationship to trauma. So if I understand correctly, something like Alzheimer's, it has to do with the buildup of plaque and other I don't know how to call them, substances or toxins in the brain and inflammation of the brain. And so it seems to me that this is very much along the same lines, working along the same lines of trauma. Would the techniques that you have just described and everything that we've been discussing today also be appropriate to treat or to even think about treating something like Alzheimer's? And yes, thanks.
Alzheimer is already like a little bit the end of the line of a lot of inflammation or a lot of course, there's always a genetic component. We cannot forget this. There's people that are more tendency than others, but there's one thing that is called epigenetics, and epigenetics is the amount of external factors that exist to make the genes express. So if you live a really healthy life, if you don't have any stress, if you don't have any inflammation in your body, and if you have 90% of probability of getting dementia, maybe those genes are not going to express because the factors, they weren't there. If you have those factors a lot, you're always stressed, you went to war, you have McDonald's every day, you have inflammation because of alcohol, and then you just have 10% of probability of having dementia, maybe you're going to have dementia. So regulating and self-regulating is always important. Of course, for dementia, you have chemicals, you have medication that they go really sharp to the amyloid plaques that they gather in the cells, that somehow activate the hippocampus just to give you a little bit more memory when you start to have memory loss. But the degenerative disease like dementia is degenerative. It never goes back. What you need is to do preventive medicine. And it's really hard to understand if you have the gene or not. If you have your family, you can understand, you can trace it and so on. So people that have in the family, the advice is, before it comes, prevent. And to prevent is to self-regulate.
Great. May I add something else? I was just curious, you have described a lot of trials and research dealing with the brain scans, and we are always speaking about trauma, but are there, I'm assuming that there are also a lot of trials about the opposite end of the spectrum, which would be like extreme coherence, like all these long-term meditators, etc. And what I'm curious about is, are there trials, is there research looking at the long-term effects of these therapies and how they change the brain, even if there was not a pathology of trauma to begin with, or a condition of that? So what does it do to the brain towards the coherent side?
The meditation?
Oh, any of these therapies. Starting with psychedelics, for example.
Long-term research in psychedelics, they're not yet like what we call longitudinal studies, that is like 10-year studies, because only now again the psychedelics started to be researched. But with meditation, there exists.
Okay.
And I think the results are really good, and I can share with you, you have more activation of the hippocampus, more memory, less activation of the amygdala, and so on, and so on, and so on. But what I think the big thing we need to take out of this study is that someone that meditates, what happens is the default mode network shuts down. The default mode network is always the problem, let's call it that way. And we're always in default mode network. If you're not acting, like now I'm giving a talk, I'm not on default mode network, I'm acting. But if this ends, I go automatically to default. And default mode network, then there's always a tendency to create a little bit of stress, because you're always or anticipating or ruminating what happened in the past. Always like, yesterday I didn't should do that, or tomorrow I need to have another talk and I'm stressed. So there's always this self-referencing yourself to the non-present moment. And this always brings a little bit of stress. So meditators, they tend to shut down the default mode because they're always meditating on the present moment. They're always on the salience network. And by being on the salience network, they regulate more. There's less cortisol, there's less sympathetic state. So all of their systems, they get less smashed with non-good things.
Great, thank you.
Salience is the important network.
Okay, great. So we stay with salience. Okay. Can someone live on salience all the time?
I think it's possible. If you see those meditators, they live like they are always like embodied. Embodiment is a good expression as well.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. Salience and flexibility, because you need to jump from others. Like if I'm planning what I'm going to do tomorrow, I need to be on default mode network. So, but then I need to get out. And imagine that there is 90% default mode network or 80% and then 10 salience and then 10 executive. If we can do 20 default mode, 40 salience and the rest executive, our lives and brains will be way more powerful.
Wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Francisco. So we will have two last questions and we will finish after them, okay? As we told before. We have here one more question from Daisy. Is it possible during psychedelics that with some people the ego remains? Or does it always go? When fear comes, is it only emotional then?
That's a really interesting question. It depends on the moment and the psychedelics. For instance, ayahuasca is a really long journey and different things happen. There's different phases. And for instance, if you do a breath work, usually it's short in time. If you do somatic therapy, it's 1 hour, 2. In ayahuasca, it's longer and there's many things happening. So there's moments that are called the non-peak moments that the ego is still there. It's still default mode network. Is when you're like, oh, I'm vomiting and everyone is looking at me. That's ego. When you're on the peak moments, you don't care if you're vomiting, if you're not vomiting, if people are there, if people are not there. You're just feeling everything that's coming from your body, from your trauma, and so on. That's when the ego goes away. Sometimes you have long peak moments. Sometimes the peak moment comes, goes away, comes, goes away, comes, goes away. But this is going from different networks, in and out, in and out. That's why a ceremony gives flexibility. And for sure, you spend more time in silence than usually you spend. So that's why you have all the benefits and the feelings that you feel after and during. But it's important the ego to come back. One of the things that I usually say when I give talks about this is that it's really important to know who you are and to have your identity before go to an ego dissolution experience, because your ego is dissolved and then it comes back. If you're not sure who you are, like a schizophrenic or psychotic person or an egocentric person, when the ego gets to be structured again, it can be structured in the wrong way. That's why some people can get a psychotic attack after a ceremony and they can think that they're going to save the world, or that they are Jesus, for instance. Or they can get egomaniac, and you have many people that after ceremonies, they want to be shamans. So this is because they didn't have a structured ego before they destructured the ego. So it's really important to be healthy in terms of your ego, even if sometimes it's difficult, because sometimes people have problems, diseases, symptoms. That's why they're going to do the ceremony. But it's important for the therapists that are doing the ceremony or they're helping to make sure or help someone before to have their ego structured, before they get into a moment where the ego is going to fade away. Because when he goes back to his position, if you're not sure who you are, there can be some slight problems. And usually we see this more and more.
Wow. Thank you. And the very last question for today.
The last one.
Yes, I see that people are writing more, but we need to stop somewhere because it's it's already at 8:22. So this will be the last one from Katarina. I have a question about experimenting with psychedelics. In November, I had an experience with my boyfriend at home. And what's funny is that it felt like I had two me's inside of my brain. one of which wanted to visit my trauma, but the other stopped me and I couldn't go there. Is this normal? Why does it happen? Thank you so much. It was amazing.
Really interesting question. I think this touched a little bit the conversation about the ego. So the ego really usually wants to survive, no? The ego is used to its traumas. The ego likes its traumas and is used to feed from these traumas because that's why usually we say that we tend to go to a type of relationship that mimics the traumatic relationship we had, because it mimics the vinculative attachment that we created or that we bring from our parents. And because this is how we are used to operate. When it comes the ego dissolution moment during an ayahuasca ceremony or during any type of psychedelics, like LSD, the ego separates, no? There's the non-ego feeling the trauma, going there, and then the old ego still trying to survive. Usually it's normal when you don't have a big enough dose to completely dissolve your ego. If you have a really big dose, I don't think the old ego will still be there trying to not make you go to your trauma. It just goes away. So this can happen, no? So when you are like in between, and then yeah, I think that's because of this. It's because of the amount of the psychedelics or the dose, and your old ego still wants to be connected to the modus operandis or the life or that you used to have. Because when you lose a trauma, you lose a little bit of yourself. You're losing something, that's for sure. And about the last one.
And it was the last one. Thank you very much,
There's a lot
Francisco.
of questions actually, yeah. One, two.
Yes, but it was more connected to previous ones, like
Okay.
other, how to say this, not perspectives, but from questions that you already answered, but some additional things. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you
Thank
for
you
your
so much.
ability to share with us and to stay with us to fulfill all of these questions. Thank you for this amazing lecture. I believe some people will come back to recording of it and to watch again, our students. And maybe then I will come, as you told about your contact, if someone is interested to go to do some test or something, so I can share with our school members.
Yes, so if you want to in the clinic, or if you have patients that need any type of brain scan, or if they need, or if they want to do neurofeedback, clinical neurofeedback, that is self-regulation helped by the brain sensor or the light therapy, we do. And we do that integrated with somatic psychotherapy and breathwork. So you're doing the breathwork at the same time, you have the biofeedback telling you how activated you are or not. Regarding the PowerPoint, if you have time, go and read like more in detail each slide because there's important information. I went quite fast because I didn't have time, but there's quite detailed information if you want to understand every area, how they are connected, how they operate, and so on.
So if you allow, I would download presentation and I would share with everyone who was now on this open class so they can go deeper, because I'm receiving in private messages much more about these questions. Can we receive presentation? Can we have a recording? Where can I find this information? Where I can find this or that? So I believe it's like true fountain of sources for us to learn, even to go deeper. Thank you so much for bringing all of this. And we will finish just now, and we can open our mics to say thank you to Francisco, to bring our voices to him. And
Thank
Obrigada.
you.
Muchas gracias.
Amazing.
Bom.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you all. It
Good
was
night. Thank
amazing.
you.
Good night.
Thank
See
you.
you in 1 month on the next open class. And now all our love to Francisco. And we can put music and to finish this open class so everyone can go to rest, to your families, to your kids, to your life, to your dogs and cats, to everyone who is waiting for you. Thank you. It was incredible. It was
Bye-bye.
beautiful.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. So
Bye-bye.
good.
Have a
Thank
nice
you.
night.